Before we come to First Minister's questions, members will wish to join me in welcoming to the Chamber the Prime Minister of Lower Saxony, Mr David McAllister. We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day. First Minister.
Well, I'll be meeting the aforesaid Prime Minister of Lower Saxony. It should be said it's of huge interest to Scotland that somebody with such strong Scottish roots is Prime Minister of such an important German state. And I think that the discussions will be for the mutual benefit of both Scotland and Lower Saxony.
Joanne Lamont. And I certainly join the First Minister in hoping that these are very constructive and useful discussions that he has. Last week, the First Minister advised me that I had made the mistake of not asking the right question, and you know what, I think I'm going to do it again. Last Thursday, the First Minister said, quote, "The Bank of England is an independent central bank that does not take direction on policy." Does he stand by that statement?
First Minister.
Bank of England is an independent central bank that's independent of government. That position was awarded to it by the Labour government of 1997, when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, who regarded it as one of his greatest achievements of his term of office.
Joanne Lamont.
Yes, of course the First Minister now knows that the statement he made isn't true, or perhaps the First Minister is struggling again with the definition of independence. The only independence the bank has is to set interest rates to meet the inflation target set by the UK Government. When it comes to printing money, it needs the Treasury's approval. Indeed, the Bank of England doesn't have any money. It's all taxpayers' money through the Treasury. So when the First Minister's spokesman says, quote, "The UK Government has had no say over monetary policy since the Bank of England was made independent in 1997, he was wrong, wasn't he?
First Minister. First Minister.
Well, let me refer to Joanne Lamont. The Bank of England is an independent central bank. If that wasn't the case, then what on earth was Gordon Brown boasting about in 1997 as his great demarche? I know that Joanne Lamont disagreed with the former Prime Minister on a range of things. Perhaps you should consult him to see what on earth he was doing in 1997. But just in terms of the debate, and I very much welcome Joanne Lamont's continuing contribution to it. She'll have noticed this morning the comments of Professor Blanchflower, one of the most prominent members of the Monetary Policy Committee of recent years, substantially supporting the very reasonable suggestions that have been put forward by the Scottish Government. Now, I know that Professor Danny Blanchflower has been quoted at length. David Blanchflower has been quoted at length by the Labour Government in a whole range of ways. Given that they've awarded such importance to David Blanchflower's comments, will she now accept that there must be something in the arguments put forward by the Scottish Government if such a prominent member of the Monetary Policy Committee says they are very substantially based? Joanne Lamont have to move away from this idea that, for some reason, Scotland is the only country which can't have normal procedures, conduct a monetary policy in an effective way, and also, of course, have control over our tax and finance, which will enable us to direct the Scottish economy in a substantially better way than under the dead hand of the UK Treasury.
Joanne Lamont. The First Minister's problem is that he said the Bank of England is an independent central bank that is not to take direction in policy. That is simply not true. It's also the case, he quotes David Blanchflower, he is talking about whether there should be a Scot on the current Monetary Policy Committee, your objection to it as it stands. He does not make an observation on your assertion and your Deputy First Minister's assertion and absolute statement that an independent Scotland would have representation on a Monetary Policy Committee. That is not true, because you haven't even asked the Bank of England if it would be the case. Let's see what the Treasury says. They say, and I quote, "Scotland using the pound through a sterlingisation mechanism," I think the First Minister last week called it the sterling zone, "would have no say over its own monetary policy as set by the Bank of England. The First Minister wants to leave the United Kingdom, remove Scotland's representation at Westminster and have less say in the formulation of monetary policy. Why? Why does the First Minister plan to lessen our influence? Why does the First Minister plan to lessen our influence over our own economic policy?
Can I say
First Minister.
Joanne Lamont, it is arithmetically impossible to have less say than zero, because we have zero say at the present moment. Fantastic, this new interpretation of the status of the Bank of England. The Bank of England was an independent central bank. It was established as such by Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1997. If he hadn't been establishing that, then what on earth was the direction of policy about that he announced in 1997? But Joanne Lamont will be delighted to know that, of course, the Fiscal Commission, appointed by John Swinney, comprising of 2 Nobel laureates and other distinguished economists, is working on these very matters at the present moment to make proposals, and I'm sure that I'll inform Professor Joseph Stiglitz and Professor Jim Merleys that Joanne Lamont has an important contribution to make, and I'll pass on that expertise to them. But I think we better start with the premise that the Bank of England is an independent central bank. It was established as such in 1997. That Scotland has no influence at the present moment. And in terms of the proposals that we are putting forward, supported by Professor David Blanchflower, that seems an entirely better position than we are in at the present moment. But regardless of that, in terms of the control over Scotland's spending and taxation, these are crucial, important matters currently directed by the United Kingdom Treasury, and I think they should be directed in Scotland, because no one, and certainly not the UK Treasury, would do better by the Scottish people and the Scottish economy than Scots making decisions about our taxation and spending here in Scotland.
One moment, Ms Lamont. If Mr Patterson, Mr Gibson and Mr Scott could please cease their conversations, perhaps we might hear the questions and the answers. Joanne Lamont.
I think the First Minister would require his colleagues with a Nobel Peace Prize or prize of whatever kind by Nobel to be able to explain the answers you have just given. They are entirely incomprehensible to those of us that are in here. On the question of Scottish influence, we had a Scottish Chancellor for 13 years making policy which wasn't good enough for the First Minister. But now we're hoping that in an independent Scotland we might possibly have a representation on a monetary policy committee, which of course has not been confirmed. The truth of the matter is that the First Minister's plans for leaving the United Kingdom will leave Scotland with less control over our economy, not more. And you know, either monetary policy is handed over to a foreign government with sterling, or it's handed over to German bankers in the euro. And all the assertions in the world doesn't make that difference.
Order!
Because, of course, if the First Minister had the courage of his convictions, he would be alongside his old deputy, Jim Sillars, arguing for a separate Scottish currency. But we can only presume that he has worked out that no one will vote for that. So isn't he just coming up with an incoherent assortment of assertions in the hope he can hoodwink the Scottish people long enough to win his referendum?
First Minister.
Joanne Lamont's desperate in need of a new scriptwriter so she can read out better questions on a week-to-week basis. Well, currently, the argument from Joanne Lamont is that we have some sort of control over policy at the present moment. If we follow her argument, and the Bank of England is really not independent, despite what happened in 1997, then that means the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, is directing things at the present moment. So Joanne Lamont's argument rests on the idea that we have some influence and control over the activities of a Tory Chancellor. It seems to me quite obvious that we have no control, no influence, zero influence at the present moment. As I pointed out to Joanne Lamont, arithmetically, you cannot have less than zero in terms of control. So let's establish the point in terms of monetary policy. The Bank of England is independent, directs monetary policy. But let's move on to fiscal policy. That's control of taxation and spending. Currently, this Parliament has 8% control of our taxation base. That will rise to about 18% with the changes that are being made in the Scotland Act. We want, this side, the Scottish National Party and many people across Scotland to have 100% control of our taxation. That, can I say to Jan Lamont, is what we call independence. What she thinks is control is relying on a Tory Chancellor in London. I think we'd rather rely on a government elected by the people of Scotland to take the decisions in the interests of Scotland.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Having met with the Prime Minister of Lower Saxony this morning, I too would like to wish the First Minister well for their discussions later on today, and to ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
No plans, near future.
Ruth Davidson.
This week we saw a British aid worker rescued in Afghanistan in a textbook raid by UK Special Forces. The daily work of our security forces at home is to look after our people and our assets. The First Minister has repeatedly staked the economic stability of a separate Scotland on North Sea oil and gas. These assets are currently protected by the full range of the British security services, including Marines, Special Forces and the intelligence community. The SNP's own defence spokesman, Angus Robertson, has conceded that it would be imperative to ensure that our oil and gas fields are adequately protected. So, with Angus Robertson identifying the need, has Alex Salmond come up with the plan? Will a separate Scotland have its own special forces?
First Minister.
Independent Scotland will have the range of forces required to establish the security of the country. But can I say to Ruth Davidson, there is actually a working example, is there not, of a small European nation which actually has marginally more resources in the North Sea than Scotland would have. Marginally more, but still very substantial. And that, of course, is the country of Norway. Now, I have never heard it suggested that in any way Norwegian oil installations are somehow at risk because they are being protected and supervised by Norwegian forces. Is she seriously arguing that an independent Scotland couldn't provide the same security over our oil and gas assets that Norway does over its oil and gas assets? Of course, there would be one big difference. In an independent Scotland, the revenue in which to pay for the range of public services, including our security forces, would come to Scotland, as opposed to disappearing into the maw of the Tory Treasury in London.
As he raises the point of Norway, I'm sure the First Minister would want to join with me in welcoming the Prime Minister's announcement of an energy partnership with Norway this morning, which will see multi-billion-pound investment in the North Sea. But he somewhat misses the point, because while a former SAS Deputy Commander, Clive Fairweather, has stated that Special Force expertise is vital in looking after our oil and gas assets, and it would take years for Scotland to build such a regiment and cost tens of millions of pounds, the First Minister's own fag packet blueprint for defence, unveiled in January, had one naval base, one air base and one army brigade. And Special Forces was conspicuous only by its absence. Norway has the Special Forces. I'm asking if Scotland would have the same. Because we did not hear a cheep about Special Forces, nor a Scottish MI5, nor a Scottish MI6, nor GCHQ monitoring. We know from a few moments ago that the First Minister is happy to rely on the Bank of England to be the lender of last resort, but is he content on having what would then be the Special Forces of another country being Scotland's defence of last resort too?
First Minister.
The first thing I said in answer to the last question was yes, we'd have the range of forces required to protect the Scottish assets. Now, it's interesting the Prime Minister is in Norway today. I can absolutely tell Ruth Davidson that one thing the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will not do in Norway today is suggest that in any way, shape or form the Norwegian government is incapable of protecting Norwegian oil and gas assets in the North Sea. And isn't it extraordinary? extraordinary that the unionist parties in Scotland, Tory and Labour, are willing to praise and say how well these small, independent European countries are doing, managing their assets, signing agreements with them, lauding with them of praise, except when it comes to the small European nation of Scotland, which somehow, according to the Conservative Party, is incapable of doing things that other countries take for granted. In terms of the security of this realm, the reason that we have one Air Force base and one naval base is that the Conservative Party and the Labour Party before it closed all the rest. In terms of our armed forces, then, of course, the continuing threat to the integrity of the Scottish regimental tradition, I read, reported in the papers today, should make every Conservative in this Parliament hang their heads in shame. And finally, on the basis of security that we are charged with at the present moment, let's look at the record numbers of police in Scotland, the standing ovation to the Justice Secretary and the Police Federation, the huge decline in police numbers in England and Wales, and the slow handclap to the Home Secretary of the English Police Federation. Another reason for the Conservative Party to hang their heads in shame.
Question number 3, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the recently published Audit Scotland report, the National Fraud Initiative in Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government welcomes the latest National Fraud Initiative report. These reports make a huge contribution to the protection and security of public sector finances. This is a time of severe pressure on public sector budgets, and therefore any fraud against the public sector is entirely unacceptable. We must take every action we can to safeguard taxpayers' money and to ensure that, as far as is possible, it is used for all intended purposes.
Murdo Fraser.
I thank the First Minister for his response. I am sure he would join with me in commending Audit Scotland for its work, which has uncovered £78 million worth of fraud and overpayments over the past 10 years. But the report highlights that there are still a number of public bodies not using or integrating the National Fraud Initiative. Given that this is an area of financial policy over which he does currently have control, can the First Minister tell us how these bodies will be encouraged to make greater efforts to save vital public funds?
First Minister.
Well, I think two things. One, the Scottish Government bodies fully cooperate, as Murdo Fraser should know, with the National Fraud Initiative. And secondly, put in the context, we should look at Robert Black's comments. Most people are honest and believe they have integrity. Some make genuine mistakes, and there's a small number who set out to cheat the public sector. Our successful National Fraud Initiative should be a deterrent, exactly why we set up the National Fraud Initiative. The overall findings, of course, and I quote again, show a high degree of commitment to the National Fraud Initiative in Scotland. This contrasts with the criticism levelled at the UK Government in the UK NFI report, where it is highlighted that only 2 central government agencies have participated to date. In comparison, and I am sure Murdo Fraser will be the first to acknowledge this, all Scottish central government departments participate in the National Fraud Initiative.
Question number 4, Nigel Dawn.
Officer, to ask the First Minister what plans are being made for the year of homecoming 2014.
First Minister.
Well, the first year of homecoming delivered £54 million in additional tourist revenue for Scotland. I can confirm that planning for Homecoming Scotland 2014 is progressing well. Event Scotland is leading this work on behalf of the Government, with a wide range of partners involved in the planning. An inspirational nationwide programme of events will be developed and set around the 5 themes of ancestry, food and drink, active, creative and natural Scotland. We are investing an initial £3 million in the events programme, and details of the funding application process will be announced shortly.
Nigel Dawn.
Thank the First Minister for that response. I think what concerns me as a local MSP is that whilst there will undoubtedly be some very large events in our large cities, and I'm sure that would be entirely appropriate, I'm concerned that there should also be events in some of our smaller communities and the ones that I represent and in which others represent around this chamber. Can I therefore ask the First Minister what plans there are to ensure that local communities are given the opportunity to host events?
First Minister.
Well, I think that's a point very well made, and since he was asking the question, I took the opportunity to look back at the 2009 events, and I noticed that the Angus and Dundee Roots Festival was one of the over 400 indeed, homecoming events that took place in communities across Scotland. I think these events across the communities, towns, villages and cities of Scotland are absolutely fundamental to the success of a homecoming initiative. I think we can surpass that number in 2014, And once the application process is announced, I would encourage all local authorities, indeed their partners of local authorities, the community organisations, to work together to harness the unique potential of that extraordinary year for Scotland.
Sarah Boyack.
After the last gathering, many businesses were not paid for services they provided in good faith. What safeguards will the First Minister ensure are put in place to prevent businesses from losing out again?
First Minister.
Well, we're grateful. I mean, Sarah Boyack knows that the whole homecoming event was as was just said, over 400 events. That the gathering was one particular event, but it was valuable interest and information given by the committee report. I would have thought that a key aspect is for major events which are part of the homecoming should have major significant partners and not rely on relatively small private sector companies. And in that event, the fact that, of course, Stirling Council have taken the initiative in terms of buying the rights for the gathering, I think that is a significant step forward.
Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Further to the answer to Nigel Donn, and in particular in the plans and publicity for the year homecoming, will he ensure the involvement of the various common ridings annually held from June through to August across communities such as in the Borders and Midlothian?
First Minister.
A splendid suggestion from Christine Graham, and I'll make sure that becomes part of the homecoming Scotland planning. I think, as ever, Christine Graham has put her finger on an extra aspect of community involvement which we would do well to listen to.
Mary Scanlon.
As the First Minister plans for the 2014 year of homecoming, will he ensure that the 100 small businesses in Scotland who are owed £300,000 from the 209 gathering will receive payment before further plans are made?
First Minister.
Well, I've got every sympathy for the creditors affected by the liquidation of Gathering 2009 Limited, but I mean, the Gathering was a private company. We received clear advice, as the committee report demonstrated, from the Chief Accounting Officer of the Scottish Government and what we were able and not able to do properly within the law. I'm sure that the member has read that advice and will understand the limitations we were working under.
Question number 5, Lewis MacDonald.
To ask the First Minister whether members of existing prison visiting committees will have a role in the statutory monitoring service proposed by the Scottish Government. First Minister.
Well, under our proposals, independent monitoring of prisons will be carried out on a regular basis by professional monitors who report directly to the Chief Inspector of Prisons. There remain many opportunities for people who wish to volunteer to work with prisoners, including mentoring, community mediation and restorative justice, as well as the potential to be involved with the new prisoner support service that the Government is establishing as part of the movement forward.
In relation to Scotland's international obligations on the independent visiting of prisons, I think that answer means no. And it's a very disappointing answer for those people who have given of their time and effort in prison visiting committees. Does the First Minister really believe that replacing 240 unpaid volunteer members of visiting committees with 3 former prison governors or other senior people with prison experience as full-time government inspectors, is that the right way to respond to the public service commitment of prison visitors, including councillors of all parties, or is it indeed the right way to meet Scotland's international obligations to the independent monitoring of our prisons?
I do think Lewis MacDonald is less than fair. I mean, as he probably knows, we revised our proposals to reflect the concerns that were shown in this chamber on the 2nd of February 2012 about independent monitoring of prisons. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice, for example, wrote to key stakeholders on the 24th of May, setting out his proposals on monitoring. That was sent to the Howard League, the Scottish Human Rights Commission, COSLA, the Independent Advocacy Alliance, the Association of Visiting Committees and the Chair of the UK National Preventive Mechanism. I also think he shouldn't underrate the importance of some of the things I've mentioned. The mentoring service, of course, offers support for offenders who want to reduce their offending and lead to a healthier lifestyle. The travel services provide a regular transport service to many of Scotland's prisons. Restorative justice is hugely important to address the harm caused by crime and help to work out practical solutions for the future. That's why I said, as I said to Malcolm Chisholm on the 2nd of February, there remain many opportunities for interested parties to feed in their views, including the 3-month consultation which we're currently in, and the Justice Secretary has taken that forward. So I think he's been less than fair about the range of mechanisms available which will allow people to participate in what is a vital and valuable service.
Alison McInnes.
Thank you. The Government has stated that a criterion in the recruitment of the new prison monitors will be that they possess previous high-level experience of working within a prison service. To be blunt, the Justice Secretary is proposing that the Scottish Prison Service is monitored by former senior employees of the Scottish Prison Service. How independent is that? Can the First Minister explain why this criterion is necessary when it's not required for HM Inspector of Prisons or his staff?
First Minister.
Well, I think it's reasonable to ask for significant expertise and qualifications and experience when you're asking for these things. But what I'll do for Alison McInnes is I'll ask the Justice Secretary to look at that point in detail and give her a fully considered reply. I don't think we should diminish the request. There are many, many people in Scotland who fulfil that criteria. We want the very best people available for the institutions which are being established. But I'll ask the Justice Secretary to specifically reply and see if he can allay some of Alison McInnes's concerns.
Annabel Goldie.
How much more expensive is the proposed new system?
First Minister.
Well, the move to the new system, we are confident, will not just fulfil not just our statutory requirements, but requirements we should have, and we believe it will deliver substantial value for money.
Question number 6, Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the figures from the National Records of Scotland showing that the population is at its highest ever level.
First Minister.
Well, it's very encouraging that Scotland's estimated population has now reached 5,254,800, which is its highest ever level. Population growth, of course, was a key priority in the Scotland's Perform indicators. The target is to match the average European population growth over the period from 2007 to 2017. These latest statistics indicate that we're on track to substantially reach that target.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thank the First Minister for his answer. Scotland does have a proud history of welcoming people from across the globe and have undoubtedly enriched Scottish society. However, in Dundee, our life sciences and games sectors often have problems when recruiting specialist staff due to restrictive UK immigration laws. Can I ask the First Minister what steps he can take to get the message across the UK Government that immigration is not a dirty word and ensure that we can recruit the talent needed to drive forward Scotland's economy?
First Minister.
Well, I think Joe Fitzpatrick touches on a key point. With not just life science and games sectors are bringing to the attention of government, but a range of industries are finding difficulties in key skill requirements, which is preventing investment in our country at the present moment. I'm assuming that wasn't the intention of the Home Office in terms of the most recent guidelines, and I suspect and believe they should listen. I'm particularly concerned because we've had huge success, as this chamber will know, in the increase in overseas students to Scotland's universities, over 20% increase. And as this chamber has always reflected in its entire 30 years of existence, the real importance of not just encouraging international students into the economy, but allowing these students to have the opportunity to for work experience in our economy. And I really hope that we can send a joint substantial message to Damien Green, the UK Immigration Minister, that the proposals he is making should not be allowed to harm businesses and investment in Scotland, nor should they in any sense restrict the international excellence of the Scottish education system.
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will know that the greatest population growth is recorded in Edinburgh, Midlothian and Aberdeen. And I am anxious to know that there is going to be a reallocation of resources which this time will take account of that population growth, as we then would avoid the mistake of underfunding the Health Board, for example, which happened under Arbuthnot.
First Minister.
I know that Margaret MacDonald will have noted and welcomed the decision of this government, in the face of criticism and opposition from others, to put a funding floor on the COSLA allocation to local authorities, which of course has benefited both the City of Edinburgh and the City of Aberdeen. That was designed to ensure fairness for all Scotland's local authorities. A similar system being introduced for health boards as well. And these are substantial changes. They haven't been greeted unanimously with satisfaction. I hear voices from the Labour benches. I hope they're going to be able to tell people in Edinburgh, which we now control in an SNP Labour coalition, or in Aberdeen, why on earth they wanted to criticise that obvious fairness which was introduced into the funding allocations. But I know Margaret MacDonald would want to welcome these changes that have been made and recognise their significance.
Richard Simpson.
First Minister, the increase in population is in part accounted for by the increase in the number of births. The population has risen since 2001. The number of births has gone up from 52,000 to almost 59,000. Would you like to invite his Cabinet Secretary for Health to reconsider the fact of cutting the student midwifery intake by 40% when the birth rate's gone up, when the complex problems of drugs and alcohol are increasing, when we have poor breastfeeding rates, and when we have high rates of smoking in pregnant women? This is not the time for these cuts.
First Minister.
I think Richard Simpson should welcome the excellent trends in population we're seeing. These matters are fully discussed to make sure there is adequate provision of midwifery and other key services in the Scottish Health Service. It's worth remembering that if the Labour Party, if Scotland had the misfortune of a Labour government in 2007, they would have spent less on the health service. If you remember, other services like health were to cut their cloth as all consequentials were to be awarded elsewhere. And of course there was no guarantee from the Labour Party led by Ian Gray and Joanne Lamont in order to protect National Health Service spending at the last election either. So one thing we can be absolutely certain of, that if the Labour Party had won the election in 2007 or last year's election, that less money and less resources would currently be spent on the Scottish National Health Service. Which is only one reason why Richard Simpson is sitting where he is and this government is where it is.
That ends First Minister's questions. I now suspend until 2:15.